Okay, this is going to go over the homework for page number 6, numbers 1 through 6. It's factoring 4 terms by grouping. So let me get this zoomed in. And okay. Step number 1, group the first 2 together and the last 2 together. Okay, for the first group, I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor. To do that, I need to have the prime factors of the first term, the prime factors of the second term. I see they both have an x, so I'm going to factor an x out, and I'll be left with x plus 3. Okay, when I come over here, the only prime factor is an x, the only prime factor is a 3. So if you notice, they don't have anything in common. Now, when that happens, you will still have an understood 1 for each of these terms. X is the same thing as 1 times x. 3 is the same thing as 1 times 3. So if they don't have anything in common, you will factor out the understood 1. Okay, and then what's left is x plus 3. Now when you get to this point, you look here and here, the binomial should be the same. They both have a binomial of x plus 3, so I'm going to factor out the binomial x plus 3. And when I factor it out of here, what's left is an x. And when I factor it out of the second group, what's left is the understood 1. Okay, so you may want to just put a note that there is an understood 1 that you can factor out. That way you'll have the note for later. Okay, number 2. Group the first 2 terms together. Group the last 2 terms together, and the sign in front of the term goes with it, and it's a positive, so plus. Okay, now you have to factor out the greatest common factor from the first group, so that means I need to look at the prime factors. Here's the prime factors of the first term, the prime factors of the second term. They both have a b, so I'll factor a b out. In the first term, I'm left with a b. In the second term, I'm left with the minus 2. Okay, now I know when I go to do the greatest common factor here, I should be left with a binomial that's b minus 2 because I want my binomials to be the same. So I'm going to keep that in mind when I'm doing this. Okay, so for the second group, I'm going to look at the prime factors. The minus sign, I have a negative 1, and then 6 is the same thing as 2 times 3. When I look at it, they both have a 3 in common, which is good because I'm seeing a b minus 2 left. Okay, so we're going to factor out the greatest common factor of 3. What's left in the first term is b. What's left in the second term is a minus 2. So now when we get to this point, we look at the 2, and the binomial should be the same. It is. So we're going to factor out the binomial, and whenever you factor it out of the first group, you're left with just a b. And when you factor it out of the second group, you're left with a 3. Oh, check your answers. This is a binomial times a binomial, so multiply first, b squared, outer, 3b, inner, a minus 2b, last, minus 6. Okay. Number 3. Can't get to it. Okay. Number 3, group the first 2 terms together. And then I'm going to group the last 2 terms together. Have to get the greatest common factor for these, so I'm going to look at the prime factors of each term. When I look at the prime factors of each term, I can see both terms have a 2, both terms have a j. So the greatest common factor will be 2j. And then what's left in the first term is a j. I have my plus sign. And in the last term, there's nothing left. But remember, there's always an understood 1. Okay, now I'm going to go to the second group. I need to factor out the greatest common factor. So I'll look at the prime factors of the first term as 3 and j. The second term is a 3, so the only things they have in common, remember that understood 1 is there. I'm going to go ahead and write it now, and the 3. Okay, now when we look, they both have a 3, so we're going to factor out the 3. And then what's left in the first term is a j. What's left in the second term, that understood 1 is right there. Okay, when you get to this point, you look at these 2, and your binomial should be the same. They both have a binomial of j plus 1. So I can factor out the binomial j plus 1. Okay, when I factor it out of the first group, what's left is a 2j. And when I factor it out of the second group, what's left is just a positive 3 or a plus 3. So this is your answer. To check it, you can use FOIL because it's a binomial times a binomial. So that's 2j squared. That's 3j. Got it. That's 2j. Got it. And that's a 3. Okay. All right, so number 3. Now we're going to number 4. Right there. Okay, group the first 2 terms together and group the last 2 terms together. Okay, now I have to factor out the greatest common factor from the first group. So I need to look at the prime factors of each term. So for the first term, the prime factors are 2 times a times a. For the second term, there's a minus sign, so I'm going to be intentional about writing a negative 1 for that minus sign. 4 is the same thing as 2 times 2, and then you have your a. They both have a 2. They both have an a. Okay, so I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor of 2a. What's left in the first term is an a. What's left in the second term is a negative 2 or a minus 2. Now let's go to the last group, or the second grouping. They don't have anything in common, but notice I see the binomial looks like the binomial here, and that's the goal of what we're trying to get to. But I still need to factor out a greatest common factor. But they don't have it. The only prime factors of this one are a. The only factor of this one is a 2. Remember, they both have an understood 1. 1 times a is a, 1 times 2 is 2. And actually, this one's negative, but we don't have to do that because I don't want to factor out the negative because I need it to stay a minus 2. All right, so we are going to factor out a greatest common factor of 1, and then we have a minus 2. Okay, so now you look here, and you see that they both have a binomial of a minus 2. So we are going to factor out the binomial, and when you factor it out of the first term, you're left with a 2a. And here, when you factor it out of the second term, you're not left with nothing. Remember, there's always an understood 1. Okay, it's like a placeholder. You have to have it right there. Okay, so that's your answer. And y'all know I make mistakes. Let me check and make sure. Yeah, okay. So to check it using FOIL, 2a squared plus a minus 4a. There's the plus a and the minus 4a, and then a minus 2. All right, we're good. Okay, let's go to number 5. Okay, first step is to group the first 2 terms together and group the last 2 terms together. Okay, in the first group, we have to factor out the greatest common factor, so I need to look at the prime factors of the first term. 6 is the same thing as 2 times 3 times t times t. The minus 4t, that's the same thing as a negative 1 times a 2 times 2 times t. Okay, what do they both have? They both have a 2. They both have a t. Okay, that's it. So I'm going to factor out a 2t. In the first term, we're left with a 3t and a minus 2. Okay, now we're going to look at the second grouping. Okay, there are no, well, I can look at this, the negative 3t. If I write those prime factors, it'd be a negative 1 times 3 times t. And then for the 2, that's just a 2. You can't multiply anything together to get that. Okay, so when I look at this, they don't have anything in common to factor out. So there is always that understood 1. Okay, but this will give me a negative 3t plus 2. I can't have that because it doesn't look like the other binomial. Here's the thing. Whenever you have signs that you need to change, you want to factor out a negative sign, or you're just going to take out a negative. The reason is because a negative 1 times a negative 1 is a positive 1, right? So there are 2 negative 1s here that I could write as factors of this. In other words, if I were to multiply this back out, 2 times negative 1 times negative 1 would be a positive 2. So now they both have a factor of negative 1 that I can take out. And then that means that here I'm going to be left with a positive 3t. Here I'm going to be left with a negative 2 or a minus 2. Now the binomials are the same. So you need to make a big star here and make a note, factor out a negative 1. Okay? This is something that will trip students up sometimes, so you want to make sure that you make a note of that. All right, so continuing on, this grouping has a binomial of 3t minus 2. The second group, the binomial left is 3t minus 2. So since these both have a binomial of 3t minus 2, I can factor out the binomial 3t minus 2. When I factor it out of the first grouping, I'm left with a 2t. When I factor it out of the second grouping, I'm left with a minus 1. And that's how you get that answer. All right, number 6. Let's make sure that's straight. Okay, step 1 is to group the first 2 terms together. Step 2 is to group the last 2 terms together. Okay, I need to factor out the greatest common factor from the first group. So let me look at the prime factors of each term. So the prime factors of the first term are 3 times 3 times x times x. The prime factors of the second term, there's a minus sign, so I'm going to be intentional about putting a -1 to represent that minus sign, times 3 times x times y. Okay, whenever we look at it, they both have a 3, and both terms have an x. So I'm going to factor a 3x out, and what's left from the first group is a 3x, and what's left from the second group is a -1 times y, which is a minus y, negative y or minus y. Okay, now we go to the second grouping. I need to factor out the greatest common factor, so I need to look at the prime factors first. The prime factors for 6x are 2 times 3 times x. There's a minus sign here, so I'm going to be intentional about writing a -1 times 2 times y. Okay, let's look for what they have in common. They both have a 2, and that's it. That's all they both have is a 2. So I'm going to factor out that positive 2. And what's left in the first term is a 3x. What's left in the second term is a minus y, or a negative y. Okay, when we get to this point, the binomials should look exactly the same, and they do. Since they both have the same binomial, we're going to factor out that whole binomial. When you factor the binomial out of the first grouping, you're left with a 3x. And when you factor the binomial out of the second grouping, you're left with a positive 2 or a plus 2. And that's it. Okay, so just make sure you try again or review number 5. But those are the 6 problems from homework. So if you want to pause it right here and just double check it, you can.